Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Design Huddle, a podcast where two internet friends break down UX and everything in between. This week, Ryan is out, unfortunately, but I have a guest that we're going to be interviewing today. I've worked with this guest for a long time. He's very well known in the design community, especially around design systems and typography. He's probably best known for his hatred of icons and always crapping on me for my love of them. So I'd like to introduce Liam Spradlin. Hello, Liam.
Hey, thanks for having me.
So why do you hate icons, Liam?
I don't hate icons. I just have a really complex relationship with icons.
Please do explain.
I think we worked on projects together with a lot of icons, and I think there's something like a lot of characteristics of a design system. They're like something that serves a purpose, and like in some contexts they're really great, and in other contexts they're not, and that like it's completely contextual. So I don't hate them, but I am cautious with them.
Do you think like we're a bit like, because you have like the design thought leaders, and we've spoken about this like loads of times. Do you think we're a bit too absolutionist? Like we say either it's a one or the other, rather than like we always seem to fail to talk about the context of things? Because most times when someone comes to a topic, they're coming with the baggage of their career and everything that they've done in between that, and so they're speaking about that. I mean, do you feel that our industry is a bit too like no, the yes or no rather than maybe, which is really annoying for new designers?
Yeah.
But what do you think?
I think most of the time when someone asks me a design question, my answer boils down to like it depends, and I try to be really mindful of that in my work. But yeah, I think there is a thing like in the world of design, especially as it relates to tech and business, that we want to find absolute answers. We want to appear to have absolute answers. We're rewarded for having absolute answers. People want things like best practices and recipes that they can follow for certain things, which is all totally understandable. And I think that like those things might exist in certain contexts. But yeah, I think in general, I try to really monitor how often I'm making an absolute statement about something design related, because I just don't think that operating that way all the time is realistic.
Do you think it's down to laziness, or is it just like the business need of getting something done really quickly that you just want the answer?
I think it's human nature. I think that
That's it.
I think that I think that to some extent there's like at least sometimes I feel this like a natural aversion from ambiguity. And so yeah, I think especially when you're thinking about building something for other people and building something that's relevant to a business, the stakes feel a little elevated. So having an absolute answer is like super appealing.
Yeah. So just taking it back a bit, how did you get into design? And how did your career begin before you became this famous systems designer?
Well, that really gives me a lot of space to fill to get all the way to famous designer. I'm not sure if I'm even there yet, but my journey
my
to
bar of
design.
famous, my bar of famous is Twitter followers. So if someone has more followers on Twitter, then they're more famous. Which I'm not sure how accurate that is, but
Yeah, I wouldn't count on it. But my journey to design, as I think a lot of folks in this space would say, was kind of not linear. I didn't study design in school. I studied art and sociology, and like I think you could draw a connection there if you tried. But from
it
there,
probably, yeah. I mean, it probably is. I mean, because design does come from art, right? I mean, it's like a child
yeah,
of art.
I think that's another thing that I have opinions on, like the relationship between art and design and where and how much they overlap. But that's what I studied. I eventually got into design just because it was something that I was interested in, and one of my first jobs out of college was working at an experiential marketing place, and that led me to getting into like interactive displays and things like that. So those were like the first interactive things that I really designed. And then from there, I just started trying to make things for the devices I was using. And that led me to Android. And then that led me to um, technology generally, like exploring other platforms, which then led me to a job in New York where I was building for phones and sidewalk kiosks and
Oh,
kitchen
cool.
appliances and shoes.
So was you designing the UI for the apps with that, or actually designing the products themselves?
Mostly the UI.
And
Um,
so that's almost like service design type things, because you're kind of how people, I don't know, buy shoes, I suppose. Which is
yeah,
an interesting field within itself, because it just takes the experience starts outside of digital and then meets in digital, then it leaves digital. So I always
yep,
find that quite interesting.
yeah.
Oh, that's pretty cool. But one thing you said was Android. A lot of designers have no idea about Android. Like they basically try to take iOS patterns and just color them in Android material design style. But did you actually have like a background of Android stuff prior to your eventual job that where you work now?
Yeah, my first, I guess like my first real smartphone was an Evo 4G. I remember at the time, like I was on a Palm Centro before that, and I thought that
Yeah,
was like the coolest thing ever. But then like smartphones started coming out, and like touch screens became,
yeah, yeah,
or at least capacitive touch screens became a big deal. And I remember at the time, like it was time for me to upgrade my phone, and I was looking, and I looked at iPhones because I knew tons of people with iPhones, obviously. But then I was like, everybody I know has iPhones, like I want to try something else. So then I was looking at the
yeah.
Android phones, and I had no clue really about Android at the time. But I picked up the Evo, and then from there, I started getting into like the customization scene, which was huge back then, like installing custom
Yeah.
ROMs and themes and
What
all that
what
stuff.
year was this then, roughly speaking?
Um,
2010 times, or was it a bit earlier than that?
I would say it was probably about 2010, yeah, maybe
Yeah,
like in the summer or fall.
that's
Uh,
pretty cool. I mean, I mean, for the designers out there who are iOS primarily users and have to design for Android, and we were going to get into the design system stuff in a bit, but what would you say the primary differences in terms of user interactions there? Because there's obviously going to be crossover, hamburger menus, bottom navigation, all that. But what would you say? Would you say there are key differences between patterns and expectations from your experience?
I guess I would start with talking about like the differences in the system itself, like the platform and how like the operating system influences the way that apps work.
Yeah,
Like Android, I think, has a little bit more complex of an app structure in terms of how history is created and like where things live conceptually, um, compared to iOS. I would also say like uh, I mean, yeah, I guess we'll get into systems later, but there are a lot of like components that are functionally similar on both platforms that would be presented different visually or have different expectations in terms
yeah,
of what they can contain. Um, yeah, I think those are the two main things. Like there are like predispositions of design on each platform, I think that are just kind of a vibe that you have to get
yeah.
accustomed to. But
So if you were to say be a first time, I mean, what would your advice be to like an iOS user or an iOS designer who's going to get into the Android space, like to understand the platform, to understand the system, even before you get into like the material design system? What would you say would be the first step into learning about the platform?
I mean, honestly, I think in the ideal world, the answer would be to use it. So,
Yeah,
like, if you're at a company that has the resources to get a device for you to just try things, try your own app, try other apps on the platform, I think that's like the absolute quickest way to get a feel for it.
yeah. So, but literally live with the device for like a week or a month
Yeah.
to really understand. All right, cool. So moving on from like you were doing system design slash UX design in New York, what happened next? in the chronicles of Liam?
So what happened next from the time that I worked at the agency, building like all kinds of weird stuff? Uh, I think like what was happening at the same time as that was that I was really involved in the GDE community at the time, Google Developer Experts. So
Yeah.
I was giving a lot of talks and like engaging with a lot of startups from the position that I was in, helping them with design. And then, I ended up coming to Google because there was a position open that was pretty much exactly what I was doing then, like, being a designer and talking about design. And that was like an official job rather than being, you know, in the daytime I did one thing and in nighttime I did the other as like a side gig.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, that must have been pretty, because I mean, I had a very similar path. And when that happened, that was like the dream face. Like,
Yeah,
you can do design, ugh, I can't speak. You can do design and also talk about design.
yeah.
Um, and so that kind of led you towards working on designing systems, specifically material design. For those who don't know, could you explain material design? Is that even possible?
Yeah, I can try. I can try without saying our like one line slogan. But yeah, I would say like material design is a design system. It's made by Google. It started off as something that Google needed and expanded to something that could address the needs of designers and developers outside Google. It's based on like a few key pillars, I would say. There's like the design guidance, there's open source code for the components, and then there's like all of the resources and content and talks and things that my team also does to like bring it all together and make it usable.
So
So
would you say it's like I mean, I've heard people describe it as like branding guidelines crossed with a system spec, but it seems to be a bit more deeper than just like a page of just, this is how you do a bottom sheet. This is how you
yeah.
do a blah, blah, blah. There seems to be a lot more thought that goes into it.
Yeah, I mean, I think something that's cool about Material, especially when it first launched, is that for a lot of folks in the Android community, the guidance was broad enough to serve as like an introduction to design, period.
Yeah.
So like, yeah, we have the components and we have guidelines about how to use the components. Like, here's how you use an app bar. Here's when you should use bottom nav, whatever. But then, to back up our point of view on those things, there's also like foundational knowledge that needs to come in. So we have guidance about layout grids and typography and all of this other stuff that kind of like underpins how you use the components to give people like a deeper understanding of design as a discipline in the practical terms that they need to make a product.
Can you give an example of something that you learned that you didn't know when you first joined? As in the foundational stuff of design that you think is actually quite critical. I'm asking about three questions in one there.
I think, yeah, I mean, I think something that taught me a lot was when I saw the team working on dark theme guidelines for Material.
Yeah.
Especially having come from the customization scene, like the concept of a dark theme was not new to me, but the nuance with which you could manipulate colors in a digital environment and like the meaning of that and how it impacted the experience. Like they went really deep on that, and I learned a lot from that. I also learned a ton from our researchers, who have like 100 different versions of a text field and figure out like, here's how thick the outline should be and where the label should go, and like all of these extremely nuanced things that are based on how people actually use it in these huge tests, which is something that I didn't have the resources for in previous positions, and I think a lot of people out there don't as well.
Yeah. Yeah, and I always found like the scale in which research can be done and just like where you can learn and find things out is a pretty phenomenal space to be in. The thing which I always found interesting was when I got into, say, big tech, accessibility on the web was a thing, but it was always like, it has to be AA, AAA, and no one really knew what that was. And the thing which I learned about like design systems in general is like accessibility first, like color contrast you knew, but there was no, design college teach that stuff foundationally as a thing, because we all taught like as graphic designers who eventually became the industry as it is. I mean, how do you feel about the way that the industry now designs? Do you think the community has moved on to be much more a higher bar rather than everyone designing bootstrap sites? I mean, what was your thoughts on that?
I think bootstrap sites are valid. I'll say that first.
Yeah,
But I think in terms of design in tech, I think we have a long way to go. Um, I mean, it's interesting to me to see how design systems in the community keep up with the pace of like technological development. Like I'm always fascinated by how systems take advantage of the capabilities of device. Um, like typography is one example. It can become a lot more nuanced and support a lot more character sets once we got like higher density displays.
yeah.
Um, and there are also like effects. I mean, the whole concept of like building a UI based on an actual life metaphor with paper is something that like does require a lot of computing power, kind of. Um,
So you're talking about specifically, say, like the shadows and stuff and material and the concept of. I mean, where does the term material come from? For those who don't know, I'll
yeah,
let you
I
give that
mean,
spiel as well.
I wasn't around back when it was invented, but the story that I always heard was that someone asked the question, like, what is the interface made out of? And so it was
Yeah,
kind of an exploration of like, can we say that there is a material here? And if we can, like, what is it and how does it behave? And of course, I think like material design as a system is hugely informed by graphic design, and there are many people on the team who were graphic designers previously. Um, so I think paper felt like a natural metaphor. And it works really well. But since we're like inside a phone or tablet or a computer, uh, it can do stuff that paper in real life can't do.
yeah. I mean, do you think people, users of the devices or people in general, actually get the metaphors? Because that's always the things like we can come up with these theories of how people behave, but do they understand and do they respond and react?
Yeah, I mean, I think ideally when someone's using an interface, they don't stop and say like, I get this, or like this card goes underneath the app bar because it's lower than that. It's something that's like maybe not even perceived or even felt, but like the result of it is something tangible, which is that the person can
Did the
successfully
thing.
do what they want to
Yeah.
do.
Yeah, and I think if it's like, because I think UX design sort of sits under the banner of information design, and information design is never supposed to be noticed, as opposed to advertising and display design is the whole purpose is to be noticed. So um, it's a bit like you don't ever say, well, maybe you might do actually. I was thinking, IKEA are like seen as like amazing UX designers. Well, they never call themselves that. But you don't say, oh, this is an amazing chair, but then you might do if it's
Yeah.
really comfy. So I don't know if we have the digital kin. Oh my God, this buttons ripple is so amazing.
I mean, like me and you might say that, sure, but
Yeah, but then, we have no life. Well, I don't anyway. What? So looking at, I suppose, iOS, which is the other big, like, huge platform,
mhm.
um, would you say, what would you say the stark differences between the two are, as like in terms of the systems design? Are there, or have we reached a point where things are kind of like crossing over, where there is almost no difference, maybe slight subtle things like American English and British English, or is it actually much more detailed than that?
I want to say both. Like both platforms, I guess, could be called uh, expressions of the concept of a design system with different dialects,
Yeah,
if that makes sense. Like I think that each platform has an equally nuanced expression of their system, but they just have different ideas about what the UI is made out of, how it should respond, how things should be structured, things like that.
yeah. I always found maybe this is just from the examples I've seen, but iOS seems to rely on gestures quite a lot with some powerful features, which I've given talks about this, like there's features which no one's ever seen, but is that like, so we're just selecting text, if you hold down the space bar, the whole thing, the whole keyboard becomes a trackpad. And people are amazed when they see that for the first time. But I don't know if does Android really rely on that as much? I don't know. I mean, hidden UX always scares me because especially if there's like core things which um, the user relies on to navigate something. Uh, but I don't know. But then pull to refresh has become quite natural, normal. I don't know. What do you think about that gesture navigation?
Yeah, I think that sort of thing exists in like an interesting conversation because I mean, on the one hand, yeah, like critical actions that are needed to successfully use an app can't be hidden. On the other hand, if there are hidden things like, as you said, people are blown away when they discover using the spacebar as a trackpad or whatever, because it's not a critical function, but it does generate some like excitement and positive sentiment for the platform when it is discovered. Then on a third hand, there's like you said, pull to refresh is something that I don't know if there's a real world analog to that kind of motion that would make it discoverable outside of its own context. So once people discover it, there's this thing that happens where the pattern becomes known by people who are using these devices,
Yeah,
and then it becomes something that exists everywhere. The danger in that, like going back to the other side, is that there are people who will start using these devices for the first time and haven't been part of this like long conversation of these patterns becoming, you know, starting off as one thing and then becoming known and then becoming a standard. So like that will end up creating more considerations in the long run because these folks still have to like learn all of that history.
yeah, yeah. I suppose, and I mean, what kind of things in the real world do? I mean, imagine if you had your chest of drawers with your underwear in it. You can't pull it, and then oh look, it's all clean now.
Yeah.
like it's very actually. Well, then having said like jokes aside, maybe blinds is kind of like where it possibly comes from. You know, like curtain blinds where you pull
Yeah.
down and it opens. Perhaps is where the metaphor.
Hmm.
I don't know. That I mean, it'd be interesting where like pinch to zoom seems like such a natural thing now, but then I'm biased with 10 plus years of being educated that this is the way you do things.
Right.
Um, but it's just that natural thing of how does I mean how do you, it's like how do you design that? I'm almost like how do you design a letter? Not like as a typeface, but how do you actually design the concept of a letter?
Yeah.
That seems to be like that. I can imagine in that space when the designers were first coming up with these concepts. That must have been a very wild time. Um, like a moment in time where you don't even realize that you're actually doing something quite interesting.
Yeah.
Um,
That kind of conversation is like the space where I think like this is why this is why it's maybe this is a hot take, but maybe these spaces are where it's easy to see how appealing it is to believe that designing technology is a magical or somehow very special and unique thing. Even though like I'm of the opinion that it's not, I can see how you could see like pulling the blinds up and conceptually your perception of the space occupied by the window is completely different because now you see a three-dimensional world outside. Or
yeah,
if you think like I have a 4 by 6 photograph, like what would it be like if I could just tug on that and it gets way bigger, you know? And then you can translate that into a screen and like that's pretty cool. That's pretty unique.
yeah. No, it's pretty amazing. But the question is like in the lab, it's like these eureka moments. But goes back to what you said is you can have any kind of design system, and a lot of these things are opinionated. But does the person understand instinctively to do the thing that you wanted them to do? Is the question. And that I suppose is the journey every designer, UX designer, has to go on. Is we come up with all these views and opinions based on our baggage that we carry with us, but is it right? Is it correct? I mean, I've had some very sobering experiences when I take stuff into UX research, thinking, "Oh no, the thing which I believed for all this time is not true."
Yes.
But then that's always good. I actually find that fun because being proven wrong and hearing someone describe your design is always hilarious. I find. But moving on with that, you've also as the talking and community aspect has become your job, your nighttime hustle, as it were, seems to have evolved into typography. Or designing typefaces. So you can talk about how you've gone about designing How did you get into designing typefaces?
Sure. I think the first like quote unquote typeface I ever designed, I made because I wanted to design something for Android. Like I wanted to make a watch face with like a unique kind of modular typeface, just as like a graphic design expression of some sort.
Yeah.
And then I really liked it, so I kept going and like made it a complete kind of font. I don't know if it's still online, but um, then
That's not Wakehurst, is it?
sorry.
That's not Wakehurst, is it?
Oh
Or
no,
did that come later?
it was before that. Um, but from there, like I started looking into formal type design instruction because I had a bunch of books and things, but it's really hard to sit down. I mean, for me, it's hard to be disciplined enough to like sit down and teach myself all the things that you would need to learn in a class. And I also think that like being in a class environment and having access to other students and teachers and critiques and things is super important.
Yeah.
So I started looking into classes at the Cooper Union in New York. Um, and I think part of it also is that I think for me, I do my best work when I'm also learning some other thing, which is also like why I started Design Notes, like learning about other types of design and talking to people about that helps my design practice. So I started taking classes at Cooper Union, and I ended up doing it for like 2 years. I went through their whole extended type design program and created a few different typefaces. One of them is available publicly, Girasol. The other two are not, but I will finish them someday. And yeah, I learned a lot.
What do you actually design the typefaces in? Is it like Illustrator and plus a type making software, or?
So something like designing a typeface, and this is something that terrified me about the process because typically like I use Illustrator or something like that to sketch with.
Yeah.
But terrifyingly, the process for type design always starts with paper. So we took a lot of classes on calligraphy and pencil sketching and things like that because the other thing is like type design is another one of those things where there's like an immense, unimaginable amount of history behind it. And so all of these things, like when you see a digital font, you're not thinking about how the letters are influenced by physical writing tools and like the ways that people rendered these letters in the past, but they are, and that like those things that are unspoken and like never explained to anyone are the things that make them readable.
Yeah.
So we had to learn all of that first. Then once you have your sketches, you will scan them in to digitize them. And we used a program called RoboFont,
Yeah.
which is, I believe it's open sourced and it's all based on Python. So there's like a huge, amazing community building extensions and tools for it. But that's the tool that we used for like making the actual typeface.
So to summarize, like when you're starting off the typeface, let's say you've actually you've learned the history of the contrast of the different shapes and stuff and evolution. You're sketching out loads of shapes to get whatever the shape is.
Mm-hmm.
You scan that in. Do you take that into Illustrator or do you go straight into RoboFont?
Straight into RoboFont. I think some people have Illustrator as part of their workflow, but I always just put it in RoboFont, and I would have the sketches on like a separate layer, so
Okay.
then you can kind of trace over them.
So RoboFont's a bit like it's kind of like Illustrator vector drawing tool, but the tools are designed to design to draw the shapes of the font, right?
Yeah, exactly.
I think I may have used it. I think a long time ago I designed like an icon, an icon font. I'm sure you hate me now, you more.
I've done it too. It's
I think it's called Glyphs was the app. I mean, we're talking. This is quite a long time ago,
yeah,
and even before that,
one.
I mean that's a paid for one. I remember years ago when I was in university, I think it was called Fontographer.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I don't think it even runs on a Mac anymore because it's so legacy. But you could literally copy the vector from Illustrator and copy and paste it into like I've not. You can probably tell me what it is, but you know, it's like the chart of every single letter that you get. Mm-hmm. It's almost like does that have a name? I don't know. It's basically a bunch of squares and it has like little labels with like A, B, C, whatever, and you just copy paste the letters direct into them, and then you could export it. So most designers in college just created like the sort of display fonts that
Sure.
crazy looking ones. So just more interesting about how would you pronounce it? Is it Gisaro Sol?
Girasol.
The
I mean,
Girasol. Sorry,
I'm probably
I
also
can't
not doing
read.
it justice because it's a Portuguese word, but
Oh, whatever. Uh, but that was actually based on street signs,
mhm.
if I'm not correct. So how did you go about thinking of that as a means of inspiration?
I got inspired just by like seeing the actual street signs in person. Um,
So you were in Portugal then?
yeah, I have a few friends there. One of my good friends, Francisco, who I've worked with since the beginning of my Android journey. He's an Android developer who makes like amazing customization tools and stuff like that. Like he has a custom kernel for Android and like
Yeah.
a bunch of apps, some of which I designed.
Oh, cool.
Um, but so he lives in Portugal, and I'd been there a few times to visit him and go to his wedding there and everything. So it 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 was an area of the country that was meaningful for me. And one year I was there for, I don't know, like a week or two. And as I was walking around, I kept noticing the street signs, which had these like uh, beautiful hand lettering, and the street names around the area where I was staying were all like named after flowers, and I just thought like there was so much beauty there.
Yeah.
Um, I I don't know if that makes sense, but I pay a lot of attention sometimes to like environmental details, and I think there's like
Yeah.
so much to see there. And so I started really paying attention to these street signs because also the style of the lettering seemed so unique to me and like very opinionated and just really exactly what it was, like a complete expression of itself, which I really appreciated. So I started drawing the letters just for fun, and then once I realized how fun it was, then I started going around and taking pictures of all the street signs that I could find, so that
Yeah.
I could find, because the other thing is that the street signs were created by multiple artists. They, at least in the area where I was, they all belonged to the same team, which was part of a ceramic studio, but there were different artists, and you could see kind of vocabulary of these letters starting to develop. So I collected all the samples that I could and started digitizing them, and then I just decided to like keep going, and eventually it became a typeface.
So would you say, I mean, to bring it back to the design system conversation,
Mhm.
would you say there's a lot of crossover between design systems and the design of a typeface? Because when I was in Portugal, the one thing I noticed is they do a lot of stuff with ceramic in signs and like, a lot of mosaic. There seems to be like a very cultural thing there. Um, so do you see that there's parallels between that, like the process of designing components from scratch and designing typeface? Like you start off with the one. I'm going to keep speaking for you. You start with a base concept. I mean, how would you describe that?
Yeah, I
Or am
mean,
I just finding connections where there isn't really connections?
on on a cosmic scale, I think everything is a system. So yes, I automatically think the typefaces are a system. But beyond that, I do think the typefaces are a design system too. And even in the software, like it's encoded there too. We have the concept of components and things like that. And I think similar to the design systems that we work with every day, the starting point for a functional typeface is, what problem is this solving? Like, what is this going to do? Why is this needed? Um, I think that a lot of people get intimidated by that question when designing typefaces because you know, it was kind of like a joke during class, like, does the world really need another, like another version of Caslon? Um, like maybe it does. I don't know. The fact, this is a tangent, but like the fact that you're making it will make it something new. Um, but the same as a design system, like it's something that's meant to address a certain need or role or problem. So like that's the starting point. Then in solving that problem, you start with a limited set of artifacts. So in type design, you often start with lowercase n, for Latin character sets, I should clarify. You start with lowercase NOP and capital HOD, and those are like your control characters, like the starting
Why?
point. Um, those are the control characters in your starting point because they represent most of the shapes that you're going to encounter in the rest of the letters. The only one that is absent, I think, is diagonals, but you have your round characters, arches, stems, like all of that stuff is in there. So you start with those characters, start spacing them, and then from there you can build a ton of other letters, and then you start to see how the system is fitting together. And just like a design system also, it's like an iterative process. And
Yeah.
also like a design system, there's going to be times where someone is using your font and they need to customize something about it to fit the specific use case. So you're designing with like all of these things in mind. And I would add that like a typeface, from my experience, I think it's hard or even impossible to say that a typeface is ever done, in the same sense that I don't feel that a design system can ever truly be like a static,
Yeah.
unchanging forever thing. So yeah, in other words, to put it simply, like yes, I think design like typefaces are totally design systems.
Yeah. Just to go back even to the beginning of the conversation,
Yep.
it does, like you said, does it the need for it to exist? Well, I mean, I was going to say, well, does any piece of art need to exist? And I thought, well, you said that there was a difference between art and design, or maybe there isn't. I mean, from the history of the language, the word design, I used to meet with an organisation in the UK called the RSA, it's the Royal Society of Arts, and they run like the oldest design competition in the world. And the first question I asked them is, why do you say arts? And I said, oh, this is like a 90-year-old competition. Way back when, we never used to say design. It was called industrial arts. That's the way the term is. And then I don't know in the history of the language where that was changed with design. So from that conversation, I thought, oh, right. So basically, you do art for self and design is just something that's commercial. It's just way back when a painter doing it for like a religious building as a piece of art versus someone who's just doing like a wedding portrait, and that's just like almost the equivalent of a photographer. But then obviously the mediums become where design has become very digital, like what people's perception. But what's your feeling of like, because I know we've had this conversation, you say design is an art or is a design. What do you think? I've just said about 20 different things there, so pick one and run with it.
I think it is hard for me to say that anything created with intent is not art. That is too big of a statement to make. But but what
So
I mean,
we're here to make statements.
like what I mean by that is that I guess I'll just say, like, I think I wrote a whole piece about this on Medium, that art, like design is art. Like
Yeah.
it is. And I think people, particularly in our space in tech, I think people like to think that design is like doing something that art can't do, or something like that. But I think, I think the perception comes down to the intent of the work. And in design, we think that our work is uniquely solving people's problems or affecting them in some way. Like when I talk with Rob Giampietro, who's a colleague of ours, about this topic, he talked about how design is such a transformative discipline because you're deciding things about how people experience their lives. But I would argue in a similar sense, like art can be anything from documenting the reality that you see to getting people to think about things in a different way to getting people to
Yeah.
engage with things much in the same way as design. So I think that spending time delineating between the two and somehow claiming a separate space for design is probably not a very good use of time in public discourse.
But why not? This is a podcast, so
Yeah, sure. In a podcast, absolutely. But I think people have really strong opinions about this, and I think
why do you think that is? I mean, was it because they want to establish that they're a designer and not an artist, or that they're an artist and a designer? I mean, who cares? I mean, who cares? Like, whatever you create, whatever. Like, that's my view. I mean,
yeah,
but then I'm
I
quite.
feel the same way. But I think that socially there are embedded ideas or received knowledge about what art is and isn't, and how valuable it is to society. Um,
It's like
and
NFTs. Sorry.
yeah,
Oh God,
God,
that's
yeah. Um, and it kind of goes back to earlier in the conversation again when we were talking about like people liking to have absolute answers. People view design as a space where absolute answers exist, and art is not a space where absolute answers exist.
yeah,
But I think the notion of absolute answers is itself an illusion, further breaking
yeah,
down the barrier between the two.
absolutely. Well, just to cap it all off, where can people reach you? I know you have your relaunching Design Notes, the very famous podcast again. Twitter. You're not on Instagram though, are you? Because you hate social media.
Nope, I've left.
Oh well, that's
But I
where
am
all the
still on
cool kids
Twitter.
are apparently. But yeah, so you run the Design Notes. Is there anything else that you're up to before we go? You want to talk about?
Yeah, I would just say, the Design Notes podcast. I'm on Twitter. I'm still working on typefaces. My website is just iamliam, iamli.am. So you can keep up with all my stuff there.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much for taking time to do this. So yeah, just say thank you to the listeners. Check out the rest of the podcasts, and also we've launched a YouTube channel where we cut up the interviews in small clips so people can have bite-sized stuff. So thanks a lot, and see you next time.
Yeah, thanks.
Thank you for listening to today's episode of Design Huddle. The opinions expressed are solely our own and do not express the views or opinions of our employer.